There are moments in history when a single decision shatters the silence of diplomacy and forces the world to listen. On 18th August 2024, such a moment arrived in Burkina Faso when Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-revolutionary, now hailed as Africa's most beloved president, made a choice that stunned allies and critics alike. He expelled the United Nations top official from his country after a damning report accused his government of recruiting child soldiers, carrying out sexual violence, and attacking schools and hospitals. To his opponents, this was the red flag of a leader shutting out accountability, but to his supporters, it was nothing less than a declaration of sovereignty, a defiant stand against what they see as the tired machinery of foreign interference. And so, the question looms, is this the silencing of truth or the rebirth of African dignity? Stay with us. This is not just another headline. It is about the destiny of a continent and the dream of a people rising. Subscribe now and walk with us on this journey, for Africa Rising cannot be told without your voice. Because today, my people, we go deeper into the facts, the fury, and the fight for the future. On the morning of 18th August 2024, the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with rumors that something unusual had happened. Hours later, the government of Burkina Faso released an official statement that would echo far beyond its borders. The United Nations resident coordinator, Carol Flores Smirniak, was declared persona non grata. In diplomatic terms, those three words mean one thing: she was expelled. The reason? A recently published report titled Children in Armed Conflict in Burkina Faso, covering the period from July 2022 to June 2024, the document was compiled by the United Nations and painted a grim picture. It recorded 2,483 grave violations against 2,255 children. Among the accusations were the recruitment of minors into armed groups, acts of sexual violence, and targeted assaults on schools and hospitals. The report did not spare anyone. It pointed fingers at extremist movements tied to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but also included allegations that local defense groups aligned with the state had participated in similar violations. For the international community, the numbers were shocking. For the government of Traore, the accusations were unacceptable. In their swift response, officials argued that the report was not only misleading, but deeply unfair. They claimed the United Nations had failed to consult the government, had offered no concrete evidence, and had disregarded the brutal reality of a nation under siege. This report, the statement declared, damages the image of our country, undermines the sacrifices of our fighters, and spreads a narrative that is detached from the truth. To understand why this decision ignited such passion, one must remember the backdrop against which it unfolded. For more than a decade, Burkina Faso has been at the epicenter of violence in the Sahel region. Jihadist groups have torched villages, ambushed convoys, and spread fear across rural communities. Schools have been closed, markets destroyed, and families displaced. In such a climate, the government insists that its fighters, whom it calls the valiant Burkinabe defenders, are struggling not only for territory, but for the survival of the nation itself. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has built his reputation on this very struggle. Since coming to power, he has cast himself as a man of the people, championing projects that range from community-driven road construction to promises of free healthcare. In his speeches, often described as fiery yet visionary, he presents himself not just as a head of state, but as the voice of a generation tired of dependence and eager for self-determination. When such a leader is accused of crimes against children, his supporters do not see an impartial report. They see a weapon, an attack designed to discredit, to weaken, and perhaps to pave the way for outside interference. This is why the decision to expel the UN's representative resonated so strongly among his followers. For them, it was not merely about sovereignty in a legal sense. It was about dignity. It was about telling the world that Burkina Faso will not be humiliated, that their story will not be told by outsiders without context or compassion. We are not the villains in someone else's script, one official declared. Critics, however, saw something far darker. To them, expelling a humanitarian coordinator with decades of experience, someone who had worked in Ivory Coast, Chad, Malawi, and Papua New Guinea, was a dangerous sign. They argued it revealed a government unwilling to face scrutiny, a leadership that would rather shut the door than answer the charges. They warned that ordinary citizens, especially the vulnerable, would be the ones to pay the price as international agencies scaled back their operations. But in the streets of Ouagadougou and beyond, support for Traoré was visible. Crowds praised his boldness, framing the move as a long-overdue act of independence. They echoed a familiar refrain: Burkina Faso will not be dictated to. And while the critics raised their eyebrows, many across Africa looked on with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and unease. Because the truth, my people, is that this was not just a bureaucratic dispute. It was a clash of narratives. On one side stood the authority of the United Nations, armed with statistics and global credibility. On the other stood a young African leader, claiming that numbers without context are just another form of violence. Which of these versions will history remember? The answer to that question may decide not only the fate of Captain Traoré, but also the future of how Africa responds to foreign judgment. And as the dust settles on that August announcement, one thing is clear: this confrontation has only just begun. The expulsion of Karol Flores Smirniak was not merely an administrative action. It was theater on the grand stage of geopolitics. For those who stood in the government compound that day, the words persona non grata sounded less like diplomacy and more like a declaration of war. Not a war with guns and tanks, but a war of legitimacy, of who gets to define the truth about Burkina Faso. In Ouagadougou, the reaction was immediate. Supporters of Captain Ibrahim Traoré poured into the streets, waving flags and chanting slogans. They described him as a shield against humiliation, the man who had the courage to say no when the world expected silence. One elderly man interviewed by local radio declared, "We have endured decades of outsiders telling us who we are. For the first time, a leader stands up and says, 'We will tell our own story.'" For his followers, this was sovereignty in action, a living example of Africa rising from the ashes of dependency. Yet across the aisle, critics were alarmed. Civil society groups, opposition voices, and international NGOs described the move as a dangerous precedent. "Every time scrutiny arrives, they push it out," one activist said, recalling how in 2022, another UN representative, Barbara Manzi, had also been expelled for raising concerns about instability. To these critics, a pattern was emerging. When questioned, the government shuts the door, leaving vulnerable populations, especially children, without protection. The tension grew sharper as the story traveled beyond Burkina Faso. In New York, Geneva, and Brussels, commentators framed the decision as a red flag. Western media outlets published headlines that cast Traoré as authoritarian, unwilling to face accountability. Some compared him to past leaders who tightened their grip by suppressing critical voices. In contrast, African media was more divided. While some outlets echoed the concerns of international observers, others highlighted the deep scars left by decades of foreign interference, suggesting that the anger behind the decision was not without cause. At the center of it all was Captain Traoré himself. In a fiery address to his people, an address that would later be shared widely online under the title Ibrahim Traoré Speech on Sovereignty, he argued that Burkina Faso was not shutting out truth, but defending its honor. He accused the United Nations of publishing half-stories without context, of ignoring the progress his government had made in providing free healthcare, investing in agriculture, and mobilizing communities to rebuild schools. "Narrative is power," he said, his voice echoing across the capital, "and we will no longer surrender our power to outsiders." This speech electrified his base. Supporters called it a manifesto for a new African revolution, a sign that the continent was no longer afraid to challenge institutions that once seemed untouchable. Social media lit up with hashtags celebrating the decision, portraying Traoré not only as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as the face of a pan-African struggle. Still, the fears of his opponents did not fade. Human rights organizations warned that without external monitoring, allegations of child recruitment and abuse might never be investigated. Diplomats whispered about a growing isolation, one that could starve the country of aid and deepen the suffering of ordinary citizens. Sovereignty cannot be an excuse for impunity, one European official remarked. And then an unexpected comparison emerged from analysts abroad. Commentators pointed to an incident during the presidency of Donald Trump, when a South African diplomat was expelled from the United States over remarks that displeased the White House. The argument was simple. If the United States could defend its image by expelling a diplomat, why could Burkina Faso not do the same? For Traoré's supporters, this was proof of hypocrisy. When America protects its dignity, it is called patriotism, one Burkina Faso commentator said. When we do the same, it is called authoritarianism. The clash of narratives was not just domestic, it had become global. International institutions called for calm, while voices across Africa debated whether this was an act of suppression or liberation. Some saw in Traoré a dangerous radical. Others saw a visionary who dared to walk the path of Sankara and Lumumba. What was undeniable was the intensity of the moment. The decision had sparked not only debate but passion, pulling into sharp focus the delicate balance between sovereignty and accountability. And as both sides sharpened their arguments, one truth lingered. This was no longer only about the expulsion of a UN official, it had become a test case for the entire continent. When the government of Burkina Faso chose to send the United Nations highest representative packing, the immediate reactions were passionate, even celebratory in some quarters. Yet beyond the chants and the slogans lies a sobering reality. Such a decision carries profound consequences for ordinary citizens, for politics, and for the very fabric of the nation. In the short term, the most pressing impact is on humanitarian access. The United Nations and its agencies are not mere bureaucratic observers. They are key players in delivering aid, coordinating health campaigns, and supporting schools in rural communities. With their top official expelled, the trust between the Burkina Faso state and international partners is fractured. Already NGOs are whispering about scaling back operations, fearful that their presence may be viewed with suspicion. For villagers in the Sahel who rely on food deliveries or medical supplies, this tension could translate into empty shelves and untreated illnesses. For the political landscape, the consequences are equally immediate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has bolstered his image as the unflinching defender of sovereignty. His supporters hail him as the man who embodies Africa rising, a leader who refuses to bend before foreign dictates. In rallies and town meetings, citizens speak of dignity restored, of a nation finally standing tall. Yet for opposition voices, the decision is a warning sign. They argue that silencing outside scrutiny paves the way for unchecked power. A fragile democracy, they warn, cannot thrive in isolation. In the medium term, the ripple effects may be even more complex. The credibility of Burkina Faso on the international stage could suffer. Investors, development banks, and donor nations often rely on international organizations like the UN to provide a measure of accountability. With that channel disrupted, hesitation may grow. Projects may stall, loans may carry harsher conditions, and diplomatic relations may cool. For a country already struggling with economic hardship, such isolation could become a heavy burden. On the other hand, the move has also deepened internal cohesion among those who see Traoré as a revolutionary figure. His speeches, sometimes fiery, sometimes measured, frame the struggle as part of a larger African revolution against dependency. He invokes the names of Sankara and Lumumba, weaving the present into a tapestry of resistance against neo-colonialism. For many Burkina Faso, particularly the youth, this narrative inspires hope. Hope that their generation will not be defined by begging bowls and foreign lectures, but by innovation, resilience, and pride. Still, the danger remains that symbolism may not put food on the table. Farmers displaced by jihadist attacks, mothers searching for medicine, and children longing for safe schools cannot survive on slogans alone. If international aid dwindles and the state cannot fill the gap, frustration may mount. What begins as patriotic fervor can quickly sour into resentment if promises of progress do not match lived reality. And yet, one must acknowledge the paradox. Critics abroad accuse Traoré of silencing accountability, but many at home see him as demanding accountability from the international system itself. They recall decades when Western institutions dictated policy through the IMF and the World Bank. often with disastrous results. Structural adjustment programs shuttered factories, erased jobs, and left nations in debt traps. Back then, few outsiders admitted their share of the blame. In that light, today's expulsion looks less like suppression and more like correction, a demand that Africa's voice be heard on equal terms. For the elders who remember the assassinations of leaders like Thomas Sankara, the echoes are haunting. For the youth, it feels like a new dawn. Somewhere between those two generations lies the truth, a decision that could either cement Traore as the leader who charted a new course or expose him as a ruler whose defiance left his people more vulnerable. So my people, I turn to you. If you feel this moment marks a turning point in Africa rising, let your voice be heard in the comments below. Is this truly the start of a new era of dignity or a dangerous gamble that places ordinary citizens at risk? As the dust settles, the world is watching. Will this choice reshape the nation's destiny, or will it lead Burkina Faso into deeper isolation and despair? While the people of Burkina Faso debated whether the expulsion of the United Nations top envoy was an act of courage or a dangerous retreat, the world beyond its borders was equally unsettled. From the African Union came words of caution. Officials acknowledged the sovereign right of a member state to make its own decisions, but urged dialogue, warning that humanitarian needs must not be ignored. ECOWAS, already strained by repeated military takeovers in the Sahel, expressed concern that the move would deepen isolation at a time when regional cooperation is urgently needed. Some leaders quietly admired Traore's defiance, but few dared say so openly, fearful of alienating Western partners whose aid their economies still depend upon. In Europe, the reaction was swift and critical. The European Union condemned the expulsion, framing it as a step backward for accountability and child protection. Newspapers in Paris, Brussels, and Berlin painted Traore as reckless, a young leader courting disaster. France, with its long and complicated history in the Sahel, voiced particular concern, though for many Africans, French criticism only strengthened their suspicion that this was less about human rights and more about protecting influence. To the United States, the issue struck a nerve. Officials in Washington condemned the alleged child soldier recruitment and expressed disappointment at the government's hostility to UN oversight. Yet beneath the diplomatic statements lay deeper anxieties. American analysts have been warning for years that as France's presence in the Sahel wanes, Russia is stepping in. And with every rejection of Western institutions, every embrace of sovereignty, first rhetoric Burkina Faso edges closer to Moscow's orbit. To Washington, this is not simply about human rights, it is about the geopolitics of Africa, the contest for influence in a region rich in minerals and strategically vital for counterterrorism. Russia, unsurprisingly, applauded Traore's decision. Officials praised Burkina Faso for standing up to neo-colonial interference and promised closer cooperation. Russian media portrayed Traore as a hero, comparing him to other anti-colonial figures who had dared to resist Western dominance. In Moscow's narrative, the expulsion was not an act of isolation, but a victory for multipolarity, proof that Africa is no longer bound to a single global order. This clash of perspectives reveals the heart of the matter. To Western institutions, Traore's defiance threatens international norms and risks leaving vulnerable populations unprotected. To Russia and sympathetic voices in Africa, it represents a long overdue assertion of dignity, a rejection of the old hierarchies that defined relations between the continent and the West. The story is no longer just about Burkina Faso. It is about the balance of power in a world where the lines between sovereignty and suppression, justice and interference are increasingly blurred. So my people, as America, Europe, and Russia circle around this small West African nation, the question grows louder. Will Burkina Faso's gamble inspire a continent or trigger a storm it cannot weather? The expulsion of the United Nations top envoy has left Burkina Faso at a crossroads. The choice Captain Ibrahim Traoré made is not just about a single report or a single official. It is about the path a nation and perhaps a continent will take in the years ahead. One possible future is that of isolation. Without international partners, the flow of aid and investment may slow. Humanitarian programs could shrink, leaving vulnerable communities to fend for themselves. Diplomatic bridges may be harder to rebuild, and skepticism about the government's intentions could grow. If this path hardens, Burkina Faso may find itself standing tall in rhetoric, but standing alone in reality. Yet another path is that of realignment. Already, Russia has welcomed the move, offering words of support and promises of deeper cooperation. Other nations, disillusioned with Western institutions, may follow suit. In this vision, Burkina Faso does not stand alone, but is part of a new block of partners who share its rejection of outside dictates. Such a pivot could provide resources, weapons, and political cover, but it also risks drawing the country into fresh dependencies, only under new masters. And then there is a third possibility, that this act becomes the spark for a larger awakening, a renewed African revolution. Traore has often spoken of dignity and sovereignty, echoing the legacies of Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba. If his defiance inspires others, the continent may begin to reimagine its relationship with the world, not as a subject, but as an equal partner. In that scenario, today's gamble might be remembered not as recklessness, but as vision. For the elders watching, this feels like déjà vu, a familiar story of Africa daring to stand tall, only to be punished by global powers. For the youth, it feels like the birth of something new, the chance to prove that Africa is not a child to be lectured, but a people ready to shape their destiny. Between those generations lies the decision that will define tomorrow. Whatever future unfolds, one truth remains: the world will not wait. Choices made today will determine whether Burkina Faso becomes a model of resilience or a cautionary tale. And it is not only Traore's future at stake, it is the continent's. Because each expulsion, each rejection, each call for sovereignty adds to a chorus that asks whether Africa will continue to lean on outside referees or finally build the muscle to stand on its own. And so, my people, as the dust settles and the world watches, the question grows unavoidable. Is this the first step toward true liberation, or the beginning of another storm in Africa's long struggle for dignity? History often pivots on the smallest of moments: a speech, a march, a single decision. For Burkina Faso, the expulsion of the United Nations top envoy may prove to be such a turning point. To some, it is the mark of a government hiding from truth. To others, it is the cry of a nation demanding respect, a declaration that the age of imposed narratives is over. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has staked his leadership on that cry. He presents himself not only as a soldier or a president, but as the custodian of a dream, that Africa can rise from dependency and chart its own path. His gamble is risky, for it places his country on a collision course with powerful institutions. Yet it is also courageous, for it forces the world to reckon with a question it has long avoided. What does equality truly mean in international affairs? For the people, the decision reverberates in daily life. Farmers, mothers, children, ordinary citizens carry the weight of its consequences, but they also carry its promise, the promise that their future will not be written in someone else's capital. That, perhaps, is the heart of the story. The continent now stands at a crossroads. Will this moment inspire other nations to demand dignity, or will it bring new challenges that strain already fragile societies? Will Ibrahim Traoré be remembered as a reckless rebel, or as a visionary who dared to believe in the impossible? These are questions no report, no foreign diplomat can answer. Only time and the people can decide. If this story stirs your spirit, do not stay silent. Like, share, and subscribe, because Africa's voice must never be muted again. Add your thoughts below. Shout, "New Africa," "Africa Rise," or "It's time for Africa." Let the world know that the dream of freedom still burns bright. For in the end, my people, this is not just about one leader or one nation. This is about the destiny of a continent. And as the sun sets over Ouagadougou, the voice of Burkina Faso joins a chorus rising across the land. A chorus that says, Africa will not bow, Africa will not break, and Africa will not be silent.